What I'd like to do in this very, very brief video is actually draw out a concept that's maybe a little bit concealed inside week 4's material. And when we talk about static classes and static functions versus the object, this concept may not be so clear. So what I'd like to do is, keeping that in the background, and is to introduce the concept of a paradigm. A paradigm is from a programming point of view, a whole range of connected approaches and concepts to how you code. So, for example, we have, let's list some of the paradigms that we have. We have something called procedural programming. This is a paradigm, and we'll explain the details of it. We have object-oriented programming. We also have event-driven paradigm, and for the computer scientists, you will have something called functional programming. Each of these types of programming are different, not simply languages. They don't map always to the same language. Procedural programming can be done in tons of different languages. It perhaps is famous with C. You can do it in Python. You can do it in any language which is object-oriented, C++, C#, Java, JavaScript. We'll explain, what does procedural programming do? Let's just jump out of here and come back to it a second. The easiest way to think of procedural is wherever you have a main entry point in your code. When you have a main, you are essentially working within a procedural framework. So some of you may instantly say, hang on, your code follows downwards in a series of procedures. Along the way, you can create objects and get objects to do things. So you are using object-oriented programming as alongside procedural. They often mix together quite a lot. This was very, very popular with C, and actually you'll find even in JavaScript it uses a procedural process in some places. What's critical is that the main is the entry point, and this downward movement through the code is a procedure. So the first observation that you might make is, hang on a second. You said there were 4 different ones, but you've just told me that these two are working together. Well, exactly. This main concept you might have encountered in C or Python. Python gives you very, very simple procedural coding, what you might in the past used to be called subroutines, sequences of code. And inside that code, you created objects, you called functions, functions gave you stuff back and things like this. But this framework, the procedural framework, was a crucial part of how you're using your object-based coding. So that's the first observation. Often with procedural, object-oriented programming works very closely alongside it in this way. Let's just come and say, well, what is object-oriented programming? On its own, it's pretty much nothing. Object-oriented programming is not a completely standalone approach. It has 2 main ways that it's used, 2 frameworks. One is the procedural framework, which is the one I've just illustrated on the other side of the page, using a main and following through. The other is what's called an event-based or an event-driven framework or paradigm. So often when you look at object-based programming, you never purely encounter just objects and how objects work. You either encounter them in an event-driven context or a procedural context. So let's just spell out. Procedural, we kind of have had some examples with, you know, a main, following the sequence of code down, creating objects, getting them to do stuff. Sometimes you call functions, they return stuff to it, etc. But it's beginning and end, right? That's what gives it a procedural framework. What is event-based? Now, event-based is often tied to, and that's another framework, the event-driven framework. So when we look at event-based, this is a very, very nice fit for object-based programming. And the easiest way to think of it is this. You don't have a main, you have a graphical user interface. You have maybe some buttons down here, maybe you have some text here, maybe you have some other information here, right? So the basic logic, so this is a graphical user interface. And this is a really key part of how event-based, object-based programming works. So often in the background you have an object or several objects, right? A family of objects all doing different jobs. So let's just say there's a whole ton of them behind here. So they're your objects. And the way that this works is that with event-based programming, you perhaps click a button. Let's say that's a button, okay? That button sends a message to an intermediate layer of code. And in that intermediate layer, it builds and creates an object to handle that a message and return some kind of response and often pop something back on screen. So what you have is the objects don't work in a procedural way. So here, when we think about the main, there is no main in event-based programming. So event-based programming, you will see more of in your second year. You see it a lot in web-based. So if this is a web-based interface, you click a button, mouse. Oh, bear with me a second. Right, sorry about that. Right, so often with event-based, you might have a web page here. You click a button, mouse over, you do a drop-down event. It triggers an event, right, with information about what's happened, which is your message, right? This event is handled inside a body of an event handler, and inside that you use your objects. So it's completely non-linear. And that's a very, very common way of using object-based programming. So bear this in mind. When we are learning object-oriented programming, you have two frameworks you can learn and work with. One is a procedural framework, which is a main, and the other is the event-based. Because we're not doing graphical user interfaces in the first year, we're not going to use that framework. We're using a procedural framework to do object-oriented programming. The very last is functional. Functional doesn't mean you just use functions. It actually is a different concept altogether. These three group together and are related to an approach of program called imperative, approach to languages, which were called imperative languages. This is related to something called a declarative language. And I'll just give you a very simple example. If you've done databases, SQL is a very, very simple example of a functional language. What functional languages do is they're not interested in mechanism, how you get something to happen, right? They don't care about that. They are simply the concept of what you want to do. And what you find with functional is that you can use that to help you conceptualize object-based programming. So it's very, very important when we look at object-oriented programming that we understand that it lives in different frameworks, other paradigms. It's never an isolated structure of its own kind. It always works either with an event-based. So remember, event-based is also draws in things like APIs. So you could have a system over here, some event occurs, it could be a user transaction, triggers an event to the back-end system. This handles the event by creating a bunch of objects. Those objects do stuff, maybe look up stuff in a database, they return stuff, they return some response. It's not linear, it's not procedural. When you click a button, the only procedure is the code underneath the button, but it's a tiny little fragment. So if you have a button handler here, right, it might look like a procedure because it'll have the squiggly brackets beginning and end, and it'll have a mini sequence inside that button handler. But this is a small piece. It doesn't rely on a main starting the application, going through all the lines of code in the main to arrive at the end. Okay, so it's very important perhaps just to emphasize this rather abstract but very important framework for the way that we program.